So, I'm getting ready to do my first few poems in my series of poetry readings. I'm going to start with Rudyard Kipling. He's a guy I just discovered a few years ago. I love his poetry. So far, I've not read a single one that I have not enjoyed. Some are better than others, but, we'll talk about that with each individual poem. Just a little background on Rudyard Kipling. He was actually born in India. Bombay, India is now called Mumbai, but he was born in Bombay. His mother was a teacher. His father was a art preservationist. He wanted to preserve Indian art and architecture from the encroachments of British imperialism. However, he was actually named Rudyard Kipling, that's what he's known by, his name, he was born Joseph Rudyard Kipling. And at 5 years old, he was sent to England to be educated, first living in a foster home. And he says in his own biography, his autobiography, that he was routinely beat by the matron of the house. When he was a bit older, he moved to boarding school in Devon, where he was routinely beat by his fellow students. But he would eventually graduate, and he did credit himself as having a good education there. At the age of 19, I believe, he moved back to India as a correspondent and journalist. He worked with a couple of different newspapers, and he began writing his poetry and some of his earlier prose. Most of all of his stuff, and especially in his earlier works, all takes place in India. He loved India, and he loved the soldiers that were stationed there. He loved the people there. He loved India, and all of his stuff shows. His earlier work shows a very deep love and appreciation of the people and the places of India. Not long after that, he moved back to England. It was about 5 or 6 years later. He moved back to England. His work had traveled across the ocean, across the continent to England. So when he moved there, he was already a famous writer. This is in the 1890s. He starts writing more novels, and instead of just publishing one or two prose or poems in a newspaper, he starts publishing more anthologies, books of poems and books of short stories. He collaborated on one book, I cannot recall the title right now, with an American author, and eventually married his collaborator's sister, where they would then move to, oh no, I can't remember if it's Connecticut or Vermont, but he moved somewhere in New England. But his style of life, he could never really get used to America, and him and his in-laws clashed a lot, so him and his wife eventually, I believe it was after 4, maybe 5 years, they moved back to England. Eventually they moved to, I believe, Essex, where he would live the rest of his life, although he spent a good part of his later life in South Africa, which I thought was interesting. Now, a lot of his later work also takes place in England. I think some of it might also take place in South Africa. That I'm not as positive about. Nothing that I am personally familiar with takes place in South Africa. Some of his more famous works, he is the author of The Jungle Book, very famous. He also wrote a sequel to it called The Next Jungle Book, I believe. His other famous, The Captain's Courageous was one of his famous works. Of his poetry, probably his most famous is Gungadeen. He also does The Ballad of East and West, both of which I will be doing shortly in my recitals. He is a very controversial author for modern audiences. Even back then, he became very controversial. Later in life, he started getting very radical ideas, and he did hold the opinion that anybody not born in England was of an inferior race. That included everybody in Europe, Asia, Africa, anybody. If you weren't from England, you were just not as good as the English. The French were almost as good, and the Americans, being primarily originating in England, were almost as good. But after his association with his in-laws, he could not hold Americans to be quite as equal to English. But these very radical views later in life, even at the time, became very controversial. And even though he was, for the last 30 years of his life, the most popular British poet and author in the world, he even won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature in 1907. He was the first British author to win that prize. So, despite his popularity, he was always a very controversial man, and in the modern day, it's just gotten worse, and It seems that people really don't want to admit that he even exists anymore. So I'm opening with Rudyard Kipling in my series because I find his poetry not only beautiful, but especially his early work shows a very clear admiration and love for the Indian people, as well as their society, their everything. I think it still has some elements of his obvious racism, but it is an important part of literature of literary history, and I think everybody needs to know these poems. So I'm going to start. I've got 4 poems that I will be doing on with Rudyard Kipling before I move on to any other poets. I will probably revisit him again in the future because he has, I think it's over 150 poems that he has written, and I have not yet read one that I didn't enjoy reading. So that is Rudyard Kipling, and in the next video that I post will be my first actual poetry recital. Thank you.